Welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, April 6th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about No Labels and their announcement 2 days ago that they would not be launching a 2024 presidential campaign bid. We've been long expecting the No Labels organization to launch a presidential ticket after they secured ballot access in a number of battleground states and across the nation, and have generally been making a lot of comments about how they've been fielding a Republican at the top of the ticket, a Democrat as vice president, and in some cases vice versa, and that they were going to offer a unity bipartisan ticket for the presidential election, that they were going to give voters an opportunity to choose somebody that wasn't Trump and wasn't Biden. Now, this announcement comes shortly after the passing away of Joe Lieberman, a United States senator who was largely backing the No Labels bid. That alongside Governor Larry Hogan, who decided that he was going to run for Senate and not run on the No Labels ticket for president, and Joe Manchin, who also said that he would not be running for president this election cycle. No Labels ultimately didn't seem to have much enthusiastic support across this nation. Couldn't really find anyone who was willing to put themselves up there as a presidential or vice presidential nominee, and ultimately decided that this election was not going to be theirs. And so the 2024 race has now lost a potential candidate that could have been fueling some partisan support being pulled away from President Biden and potentially President Trump. The 2024 race is so exceptionally interesting because every single thing will matter. This departure from No Labels in the race does, in fact, at least based on what we have understood about the introduction of third-party candidates in the races and just generally what we've seen in terms of polling trends here, that a No Labels ticket would have honestly hurt President Biden more than it would have hurt President Trump. And I know that may be something that seems surprising, especially considering that they considered having a Republican at the top of the ticket, but the 2020 election wasn't won on a strict Democratic base. The 2020 presidential election was won because Democrats were able to coalesce with independents and some Republicans out there, people like John Kasich, who were unwilling to vote for Donald Trump in the general election. And even with that, Joe Biden barely won the presidential election by a margin of roughly 44,000 votes across the key battleground states of Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. That had 44,000 voters voted a different way in favor of Donald Trump, you would have seen a Donald Trump re-election, and he would be president today. And so this time around, I think looking at the amount of possibilities of potential candidates in races, people like RFK Jr. or Jill Stein or Cornel West, really up across the ballot here with a number of important parties and potentially influential figures in the political arena in the presidential election. The departure of No Labels helps Biden because it pulls away an additional opportunity for votes to be split. As I was saying, the 2020 presidential election by Joe Biden was won largely based on coalition building across some more tempered Republicans to more moderate independents and, of course, partisan Democrats. But in 2024, Donald Trump seems to be retaining this same exact base from the 2020 election. The only person who isn't retaining their base is Joe Biden. And I think there's a bunch of different reasons for it. I think he has certainly lost some support amongst different minority groups, different age groups, different demographic groups. But regardless of that, there is the fact that Donald Trump has been maintaining his ceiling of 47% nationwide pretty consistently over the past couple of months. Joe Biden, however, who is losing to Donald Trump today in a head-to-head matchup in terms of polls here, does not seem to be reaching his ceiling yet. Doesn't seem to be capturing the highest potential. And I think a big reason for that is because third-party voters out there or third-party candidates out there are making candidates or voters second-guess the candidates that are running for president this cycle. And so I think that would be a very big problem, obviously, for Joe Biden in the event that he loses a considerable portion of his base to third-party voters. But that's why this departure from No Labels is, one, a good sign for Biden. It's an improvement in terms of his expected, chances of victory. It also is the fact that, this also may send a message to people like RFK Jr. as they near major ballot wins in battleground states. Maybe it's not time to get on the ballot in a battleground state. If No Labels can pull out, why can't you? You can make a statement for yourself. And I think that's what we've seen a lot of different groups really push third-party candidates to do. I think the big things that they've sent to No Labels and RFK Jr. and Cornel West and Jill Stein is, you can get your name out there, you can campaign, you can do whatever you want, but don't do it in the battleground states. The core 7 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina, are the states where Biden and Trump are going to be campaigning the most. The reason being, they were all decided by 3 points or less in the last election and truly will determine the future of this nation. And so I think Democrats are on one end scrambling, saying, do not go to these battleground states. They're saying, this is not the time for a third-party candidate. Trump is too big of an opponent here for this to happen. And I think you're finding that a lot of people here are really trying to do whatever they can to encourage, or in some cases, prohibit third-party candidates from getting on the ballot. And so I think on one end, that's something that has been very fascinating. I've seen a lot more Democratic opposition, I think, in this cycle than I even saw in 2016 and, of course, in 2020. To third-party candidates here, because I think what the data has been telling us is that it is President Biden who does lose support, not President Trump. However, I will say the only caveat to that is RFK Jr., who surprisingly enough seems to, in most cases recently, pull either equally from both, or honestly more from Donald Trump. 6 months ago, it was a different story. Going into this year, it was a different story. RFK Jr. almost exclusively pulled from a Democratic base with some Republican support, but very, very little. And it seems to be moving a little bit over further because RFK Jr. has now become someone that Democrats have branded as a January 6th apologist. He's been very publicly anti-vaccine, anti-COVID-19 vaccination, pretty mumuch taking anti-vax standpoints and elevating conspiracy theories. RFK Jr. certainly has not been this progressive champion by any metric. He's not really a Democrat in the truest sense, and a lot of Democrats have disowned him since his presidential bid has begun. And so I think that is the only exception to what I'm generally talking about here. But regardless, this election is so exceptionally close. We remember the last one, and we should remember the last one, because this time around, it probably is going to look very similar, just with a few exceptions. When we take a look at the states, the core 7 that were crucial and key to the victories of Joe Biden in 2020 and Donald Trump in 2016 will be so important this upcoming cycle, because this is what Democrats and Republicans are working with. North Carolina went red in 2020, and the rest of the states went blue. And let's say, for instance, the independent candidates do well. They get around 9% of the vote nationwide. The good thing is, FiveThirtyEight actually has a result here that shows us just exactly how much they get, not 9%, sorry, how much they get nationwide in a scenario in which Donald Trump wins the election based on third-party turnout. And so it finds here that independent voters here, or I guess nonpartisan, not choosing Trump or Biden here, goes to around 4%. 51 to 47, or sorry, 2%. 51 to 47 with a 4-point difference between the two, with 2% pulling away to third-party candidates here. And you find that even in a scenario like that one, Donald Trump wins. It might be a narrow victory, don't get me wrong, but the map looks something similar to this one. Wisconsin goes red, Arizona, Georgia goes red, and a lot of the states pretty much stay blue. Pennsylvania, Michigan stays blue. But with this alone, if you take all the states that Donald Trump won in the last election, I can characterize them here with us because I think it'll show you, just visually speaking, exactly what this would do to the electoral map here. You start to see exactly how there comes, there is a Donald Trump victory in this circumstance. 272 electoral votes with independent voters getting just 2% of the vote. And so that matters here, especially when a lot of this independent vote is largely driven by young voters, a group and a demographic group that has consistently voted for Democrats overwhelmingly. And so when independents get around 9% of that group, which is exactly what the polls are telling us, Donald Trump wins the election because it pulls in these key battleground states. It boosts up Donald Trump in North Carolina and Florida. That was to be expected. But in Arizona, it's a plurality victory. In Georgia, it's a plurality victory. In Pennsylvania, it's a plurality victory for Biden, but it doesn't allow him to reach that majority. He doesn't reach a majority even in Michigan or Wisconsin or even in Nevada. A lot of these states that he did receive majorities in the last race. He didn't in Wisconsin. That was under 50. But in Michigan, he did. In Pennsylvania, he did. In Nevada, he did. And so that matters. And I think that is really a driving factor here as to why Democrats genuinely are freaked out, why they're worried, why they are taking third-party threats seriously this time, right? They're doing everything they can, whether it's restricting ballot access, making things difficult, pushing people in and out of the party depending on their support for Joe Biden. A lot of these things are done with intentionality because that's how a race is won. It's the same thing that Donald Trump did by moving out all of the Nikki Haley supporters. But again, decisions that are being made aren't always the smartest. I do think, though, that with no labels as a departure from the race, it does decrease the amount of options that voters get. There are certainly voters out there that want to vote for a third-party candidate that is not RFK Jr., and they probably won't vote for him even if he is that eventual, prominent third-party candidate. And the reason for that is because RFK Jr. has taken, again, so many stances that actually are becoming a lot more public across this country. People are paying a lot more closer attention to who these third-party people are. They're not just seeing Kennedy and voting for them because of that, and I think that might be a driving factor for some of it, but largely no. Largely, that's not what we're seeing. And so I think that is going to be a very big thing that we get closer to this election process. We're going to go closer to the election cycle and see that it's not always a case of just name recognition. On one end, I certainly could see that being a thing, but I also look at polls that have been taken nationwide since the introduction of RFK Jr. into the race, where you have voters out there where they ask, these are two pictures. One of these is RFK Jr. and the other one is Robert F. Kennedy. Can you tell who is who? And around 50% of those people that were voting for RFK simply could not. And so again, closer and closer to the election, more information becomes apparent, and without a no labels ticket on the ballot, sometimes voters won't have somebody to temper them. A lot of voters out there don't want to vote for a Green Party candidate. They're too right-wing. They don't want to vote for a Libertarian because they don't think they're serious. They don't want to vote for RFK Jr. because he's a conspiracy theorist. So all of these things come into play here. And again, this is not me trying to push a narrative, but rather explain one that I think has been very commonly seen across plenty of voters who commit themselves as undecided, but ultimately do choose Biden or Trump when push comes to shove. Those are the voters out there that Biden wins back when no labels is no longer on the ballot. Those are the voters there. And I think the Democratic Party has already seen the biggest circumstance where a third-party intrusion into the race. And not to say they shouldn't be running. When I say the word intrusion, I mean it does violate this fundamental understanding that it is a two-party system. But again, this is America. People have the right to do that. People have the right to run. Regardless, though, Democrats, and I'm sure Republicans too, see third-party candidates in some cases as an intrusion. I remember after the 2020 Georgia Senate election where Shane Hazel, the Libertarian nominee for Senate in Georgia, peeled enough votes away from David Perdue that he had to go to a runoff. Then they ended up losing that runoff that he would have easily been able to completely avoid had Shane Hazel not been in the race. Now, again, that's speculation. So is this, but it's worth taking a look at because I think it might explain why Democrats are very worried about all of these candidates out there and why no labels being removed from the race does in fact help. Because in 2016, Gary Johnson and Jill Stein were the prominent third-party candidates. Gary Johnson had gotten on the ballot in all 50 states, and I think Jill Stein in roughly 48. There was a huge call for, third-party voting. People thought Hillary Clinton had it in the bag and that it wouldn't really make a difference if you decided to vote third-party. Evidently, it did. I think a lot of Democrats were very upset because in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the amount of votes that Jill Stein had would have made the difference in Hillary Clinton's potential victory in these states than not. Pennsylvania, Hillary Clinton lost the popular vote across the state by roughly 44,000 votes. 44,000 votes. Jill Stein received 49,000. In Michigan, there was a margin here of around 11,000 votes. Jill Stein received 51,000. And in Wisconsin, the margin here was roughly 27,000 votes, or 23,000 votes, somewhere around there. Jill Stein got 31,000. Now, of course, Gary Johnson was in this race, and it's not a perfect science in saying that Hillary Clinton would have won the election with no third-party candidates, because maybe some of these voters for Gary Johnson would have voted for Donald Trump. But the problem here lied in the fact that Donald Trump was hitting ceilings. He was able to maintain himself at roughly 47%, 48%, in the same way he was back in 2020, getting 48.8% in Pennsylvania, 47.8% in Michigan, 48.8% in Wisconsin. Very, very similar to what he received in the last election. The only difference is here, without these major third-party candidates in the races. For instance, in Michigan, Joe Biden received 51% of the vote, and the remainder of these candidates here, Joe Jorgensen got 1% of the vote, and everyone else was less than a quarter of a percentage point. Same thing can be said in Pennsylvania. You have here, the Democrats did quite well. Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump by roughly a point, but again, Joe Jorgensen was just 1% of the vote and nothing else was in the race. It wasn't like 5-6% like we saw in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania like 2016, and that's where Democrats won back a lot of their base. And no labels, too, I think was going to peel away a lot of voters out there that are Nikki Haley supporters that are unwilling to support Donald Trump but looking for direction. And I think for many of them, no labels was going to be that ticket. Was it going to be 5% of this nation? No. Never really was it going to be 5% of this nation. But it could have been 1%. It could have been 2%. And that matters. Because what we know from the last election is that every single vote and every single percentage point matters. There's not an election that can be won here by the Democratic Party without everything going their way, simply because Donald Trump has this following that makes him and maintains him at 47% nationwide. That's where he has been. And that's where he will be in this election, regardless of what happens, at least at 47%. And so when Democrats see this departure of major third-party tickets and potentially the possibility of, removing certain, or not removing, but not having certain third-party candidates vie for certain states. Removing them out of the equation in some of these battleground states is good news for Biden and increases his chances at victory by giving voters a more binary option rather than a multi one, where we could see the 2016 election repeat itself, with third-party turnout likely driving the reason why Donald Trump won in 2016 in the first place. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.